Hi, my name's Leanna and we're today at the School of Artisan Food, the Best Food Forward project, and we're going to make some Japanese milk bread. So the first thing I need to do for that is to make a roux, but it's a roux that's combined flour and water. This is called a tanzhong, and this is the base, the starter that we use to make the bread. The way we make this is we weigh out 35 grams of flour. I'm using bread flour because it has slightly more strength and more gluten, but you can use plain flour in this recipe as well. And then with that I've got 125 grams of water. So those two go into there, and I need to put them in a pan that I'm then going to put onto the hob. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to weigh out my other ingredients ready. So I need my dried ingredients today. I'm going to use 440 grams again of strong bread flour. I have got some 10 grams, and I'm using dried yeast. It's dried fast action yeast, so you can use the fresh yeast or other sorts of yeast, but this one you can put straight into your flour, so you don't need to activate it beforehand, which is helpful because we're using butter and eggs and milk in our dough, which means that it has slightly longer time to rise. It takes a little bit longer to prove. So if you start adding a little more liquid into that creates a little bit more difficulty with the rise time. We also need some sugar in the bread. We need some salt for flavour, and this bread actually uses milk powder as well. So I've got 2 eggs as well, 175 millilitres of milk, and 43 grams of butter, which I know is very precise, but it just helps the bread get a really nice fluffy texture. So the first thing I'm going to do is make my roux. To make the roux, I've just put in my flour and my water into a small saucepan, and I'm using a whisk to stir it. What I need to be careful of is to not stop whisking whilst it's on the heat, because the risky thing is if you stop whisking, what will happen is that it'll go very thick very quickly. This is a process called gelatinisation. And this process means my starch is soaking up the starch in the flour and becoming a thickened liquid. So once my roux is thickened, I can take it off the heat and it will look very thick. It'll almost stick to the whisk, and that's about right. And you'll know that it's thickened when it has this very gloopy texture, and also it starts to bubble. It doesn't take very long, about a minute, just to keep constantly whisking, and then you should have this slightly strange wallpaper paste type mixture, which we need to put in the base of our milk bread. So I'm going to put that to one side now, because what I need to do is allow that to cool down before I start to put it in with the rest of my ingredients. Otherwise it's going to start to do things like melt my butter, which I don't want it to do. This is my tanzhong that I've allowed to cool, so it's quite sticky and it's ready to be used. So if it was straight out the pan, that would be okay, but you'd alter the temperature of your dough, which then will ultimately change the texture of your bread. So you need to be a little bit careful of how you're putting things in. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to use a mixer to make mine using a dough hook. This isn't necessary, you don't have to do this. I'm just going to show you an alternative way of doing it. You can just use the pull and fold method that I've used in the focaccia videos to do the kneading, and you'll have very similar, but you do need to knead it for a little bit longer. So you can use an electronic one, but it's up to you whether you have one and if you're able to use it. So I'm putting my roux into my mixer, and along with that I'm going to add in my flour. That's going in there. I'm going to add in my sugar, my salt. There's 8 grams of salt in here and 63 grams of sugar, again very precise. I've got 30 grams of milk powder going in. I have 10 grams of yeast. It's quite a lot of yeast, but you can also always scale the recipe in half the recipe if you feel that this is too much. It will make quite a large loaf, this recipe. So I'm going to add my yeast. The only thing you need to be careful with the yeast is don't put it directly on top of your salt, because you might end up killing your yeast then. So try and put it on the other side of your bowl. So once I've got those in, I've measured out my milk and I'm going to add in my eggs. Now if you're concerned that you might get shell in, do crack them into something else first. You don't have to go straight into your milk, because then it's a hassle if you do get shell in. So you can use the back of a table knife, or I tend to use the dough scraper. One swift sharp movement and crack your eggs into a bowl first, and then add those in to your milk. With the eggs into the milk, once you've got that in, you then just need to give that a little stir. You can use a wooden spoon or you can use a whisk, as long as you just break up the yolks and the white. The yolk and the white is called the albumen. So mix those together. I'm using medium-sized eggs, which should give you the right amount of liquid, but eggs do vary in size, so you kind of have to look at how your dough is coming along, as if you need to add absolutely all of your liquid if you are using larger eggs. So once I've got that, I'm then going to put my dough hook down like that. And I'm going to add my liquid in slowly. So I'm going to turn my mixer on a low speed to begin with, and I'm going to add my liquid in. As this is doing, it'll start to mix it all together. Now if you were doing this by hand, you would just be doing it in a bowl, mixing it with your hands till it comes together as a dough. You just need to slowly add it in. And once you've got it almost all in, then your dough should be mixed together. Now it's mixed, what I'm going to do is turn up the speed, because what I want to do is I want it to take itself away from the sides of the mixing bowl. So what it'll end up with, it'll move it away from the sides, so that the bowl will look clean. And if you're doing this by hand, that's the same principle. It will pull off the sides until you end up with a clean bowl. I'm going to turn that up now so that and then you'll see the end result. What I'm going to do now is add my butter into the dough. So when I'm doing it in a mixer, I can just use small chunks of butter and just drop them in, and then the mixer will mix that in for me. I've measured it out already and I've just chopped it up with the butter knife. If you're doing it by hand, you just need to knead those in as you're going. Just scatter some on the surface and just knead it slowly into your dough. You need to, when you're kneading, if you're doing it by hand, just be careful of how warm your room you're doing it in. If it's really warm, you might tend to melt your butter, which is then going to make it a lot more difficult to knead in. So once all of this has gone into the dough should have removed from the side of the bowl, and almost you should hear it kind of like hitting the side of the bowl, almost like it's clapping on the side with itself. It's giving itself a round of applause. So once you hear that, then you can test whether or not it's got the gluten development, and I'll show you that in a second. Once my dough's done, I can check that it's ready. So I'm just going to pull it off here, and what I'm looking for is almost like a window pane, so you can see through the dough when you pull it, and that means that the gluten's nice and developed and it's got a good texture that's going to give my bread a really nice, soft, fluffy texture. What I need to do then is get a bowl. What I've put in here is just a small amount of oil. I've just wiped around the bowl in oil. You could also use butter. The only reason I've done that is to just stop it sticking. And then I'm going to put my dough into that. I'm just using a dough scraper to get it out of this bowl, but you can use just a spoon or a spatula to get it out. All I'm going to do is put this into my bowl. If you're doing this by hand, it will be exactly the same thing. Just take it from your surface once you've finished kneading it and then add it into an oiled bowl. Now, slightly differently to how we would do other sorts of bread, what I need to do with it now is I need to firm up the butter. And the way I'm going to do that is by putting it into the fridge for about an hour to let the butter come back to being hard and firm again. This will allow my dough to be a lot easier to work before I allow it to prove. So I'm just put it into my bowl, and then I'm going to cover it in some cling film. Then that's going to go into the fridge just to firm up for about an hour. So my dough is now out of the fridge. It's been in there for about 2 hours and it's risen, and my butter is set so it's ready to be used. If it's not risen to double its size, once you've had it in the fridge for about an hour, take that out and put it in a warm place for a couple of hours to allow the dough to prove properly. You can do a second prove in the tins, so that will allow it to rise a bit more. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to tip it out onto my surface, so it should come out of the bowl relatively cleanly. I'm using a dough scraper to help me with that, but you can just use a spatula. And then I'm going to separate this dough into 4 pieces. What I might need to do is put a very small amount of flour down on my surface just to stop it sticking. What you do need to be careful of is putting too much flour down, because that will make your dough dry. So just be careful if you are going to use any flour. What I've got then, I'm just going to use my dough scraper to roughly cut it into 4 sections. If you want to be really accurate with this, you can use a scales to make sure they're all approximately the same weight, exactly the same weight, but I'm just doing it by approximation. I think that one needs a bit more and that one needs a bit less, so I'm going to cut a bit off this one. So that's about right. Then each of these I'm going to put a different filling in. Now when you do this, you can put whatever your fillings you like in. There's lots of different ones that would work. We're going to use some raisins, some pumpkin seeds, some sunflower seeds and some cranberries. But you could use a combination of all of those, or you could use any other dried fruit. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using fresh fruit because that adds too much moisture into your dough. So what I'm going to do now is just take my dough and flatten it out as much as I can. So I'm just squashing it into a rectangle approximately, which is around about the thickness of probably just a bit thicker than a pound coin. So once you've got it in an approximate rectangle, don't worry if it rips or anything, it's just dough, it's fine. Then I'm going to take my filling, whatever it is, and scatter that nicely throughout on top of my rectangle. You can put as much or as little in here as you like, but the more you put in, the longer it's going to take to rise, because the weight will hold it down. So just be aware of that. You might not get as good rise on it if you put absolutely tons in. So what I'm going to do now is taking my fingers and using my thumbs underneath the dough, I'm going to pull and stretch it as I'm rolling it up. So this is just a way of also developing the gluten, and it means I get a nice tight roll so none of my filling falls out. So once I've nicely rolled it up, tucked it underneath. And I do a nice tight tuck so it looks like that. I'm then going to pop this into a baking tin. Now with my baking tin, what I've done is just put a little bit of oil in it, or you can use butter. And just to help me get it out, I'm just going to put 2 pieces of greaseproof paper. You just need to be careful using greaseproof because some of them do stick to bread. So make sure you get some greaseproof paper rather than baking paper, and then that will enable it not to stick. So I'm going to take my first dough and put it on one side. So I've got a little dough like that. And then my second dough, I'm going to do exactly the same again. Flattening it out. This time I'm going to use some pumpkin seeds into this dough. So this is probably going to be a more savoury one, whereas the other one was more sweet. And then again, I'm just going to use my thumbs to really tightly roll it up. So hopefully my seeds stay inside my bread and I get a nice distribution through the bread. Then tuck in underneath, and I'm just going to add this next to my other one. Now this is going to need another proof now, so I'm going to allow this to prove for about an hour. Whilst that's proving, I'm going to do my other one. I'm going to take my other 2 flavours and do exactly the same again and put it in another tin. Then I'm going to bake it for around about 40 minutes on 190 or gas mark 6 until it's golden brown, and when you tap it, it sounds hollow. I'll show you what that looks like when it comes out. These are now the finished versions from the oven. They've been in for around about 40 minutes until I've got this really nice golden brown on the top. We take them out of the tin, always using oven gloves, and then we can chop them to see the inside swirl. So this is our Japanese milk loaf or shokupan. We can cut it down into the loaf, and we should have some really nice fluffy light bread with a good distribution of our seeds inside.